is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Saturday, February the 17th, 2024. A Saturday, and I'm working. It's supposed to be the weekend. You remember those old bumper stickers thanking unions for bringing us the weekend? They don't seem to be doing much these days. We're all working too much. Yesterday, we did a show. That was the week with my old friend Keith Teare, Silicon Valley entrepreneur, investor, thinker, technologist. He believes that AI is about to revolutionize the world. It's about indeed to make most people who work on movies redundant. So the big question, of course, is with all this technology, what are we going to do with our free time, and what will work look like or not look like? My guest today has done a lot of thinking about this, not in his free time. He's a professional historian and he's written a book about it, Free Time, The History of an Elusive Ideal. Gary S. Cross is joining us from Hershey, Pennsylvania. Gary, congratulations on the book. It's just out.
Thank you.
Is our obsession now with AI replacing our work, creating not enough or too much free time? Is this something that has come up time and time again over the last 200 years, or is there something different about today's debate about work and AI?
Well, it's come up repeatedly with mechanization and in the 50s, automation, tendency to automate factories and so forth. Long time economists have assumed that when new technology would take away jobs, that it would lead to new jobs, occupational migration is sometimes called. My thinking is that probably that process has changed with AI. It may be my pessimism, but I do think that there's a real threat, not just to manual laborers, to farmers and miners and that type from the past, but also to white collar workers, programmers, the people that make movies. And that'll produce free time, but it may be more in the form of unemployed time. And that's a real threat. In the past, people have thought about automation and industrialization and its threat to work opportunities. The way to deal with that is to reduce regular work time. People share the work that was available and provide more free time for everyone, but free time that was based on employment rather than unemployment.
Gary, what are you and I doing talking on a Saturday afternoon? It's early evening in Pennsylvania. I'm sure you got better things to do. I probably should have better things to do on a Saturday afternoon in California. Is it because we seem to be working all the time these days? I'm a freelance broadcaster. You're an academic and writer. Yeah. Is the problem these days that there isn't any separation between free time and work?
Well, of course, I'm retired officially, but I'm still writing and I still teach because I don't want to give those things up. So I'm very much a product of the work ethic, as I'm sure you are. The part of the difference that's happened, part of the change that's happened more recently is that is particularly with things like computer setups, the traditional wall between work and non-work has kind of broken down. In a certain way, we've kind of reverted back to the pre-industrial period where people work and live in the same time and place. In the old days, in a cottage or at a farm. Today, and in through our connections with the internet.
Which has invaded which, though, Gary? Is it work invading free time, or is it free time invading work? Many of the big tech companies out in California have designed their offices to be places of leisure, although, of course, companies like Google and Facebook, people work
Sure.
as hard as ever.
Right.
Is there, shall we say, you talk about free time as an elusive ideal, and
Hmm.
we'll get to that. But it's also a very seductive ideal, isn't it?
Well, seductive in the sense that for a very long time, people have felt that freedom from obligation, from not just toil, but being accountable to others, particularly to an employer, asking you to do things that you might rather not do, or at least at one time or another. That freedom from all that is, in some sense, a human right, and that it should expand with improvements in productivity. But I do see your point that there is a kind of uh, a mixture of work and non-work, and that certainly has come about through the introduction of these new technologies.
You've talked about the idea of a human right, Gary. Of course,
Yeah,
the very idea of a human right was invented in the Enlightenment, particularly by
sure.
the German philosopher Immanuel Kant.
Right.
Another figure of that time seems to have been really relevant in terms of this ideal of free time. Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who of course famously wrote, "Man was born free and everywhere he's in chains," meaning that we seem to be chained to labor. And of course, out of Rousseau, we get to Marx. Pre-Rousseau or pre the Enlightenment, how did people think about free time?
Well, for most people who were probably like most of our ancestors, laborers on farms or in craft production of one sort or another, um, they thought about free time as something that comes seasonally, like in long periods of festivals or intermittently when the work that they needed to do was stopped for one reason: bad weather, poor transportation, or just simply the seasonal nature of growing crops. So free time was not seen as a right so much or a goal, but something that became available in certain periods when when work was not required or not available. That particularly for the poor people. For rich people, and of course there was a very sharp division. The wealthy, of course, had most of their time was free, and they saw it as an opportunity to compete, uh, like in wars or in games of war, uh, or to display themselves. A few, like Aristotle and a few of the philosophers, felt that that free time should be used to cultivate the mind and social ties with one another. But it was a very different sort of attitude of toward free time that we see that came with industrialization.
So I want to get to the industrial age, but in this agricultural age of the warrior, when somebody went on a crusade, uh, was that for you a form of free time or a job, a form of labor? Or are those terms inappropriate in a
Well, yeah,
pre-modern, pre-capitalist, pre-industrial age?
yeah, I don't think they apply because essentially what happens with the 15th, 16th century, particularly, is that productivity begins gradually to increase with competition and new technologies, and this has the effect of eliminating some of those intermittent periods where people aren't working. It reduces the need for festivals or the opportunity for festivals for the ordinary folks, and it creates a kind of a new attitude on the part of the elites that viewed free time as a kind of a right of their status. And instead, elites begin to think more seriously about work ethics. And certainly, as we move from a time of the aristocracy to the development of industrial capitalists and commercial merchants.
You talked about something called a work ethic. Of course, the most famous work of sociology about the work ethic was Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Origins of Capitalism. He argued that it came out of an existential crisis of the Reformation, of Calvinism. Right. What's your take on that? Is there a relationship between the history of this elusive ideal, free time, and the Protestant Revolution, particularly Calvinism, which suggested that because God is so wrathful and so arbitrary, there never could really be any free time, or if there was, it would be so miserable. We'd be better off working because we'd be fearful of hell.
Well, Calvinism and the Protestant Reformation coincide with the beginnings of a new economic system. And so there are elements, there's clearly overlap, but you don't necessarily need Calvinism to have the work ethic. You could have it in Catholic countries.
So you're not in the Weber camp, Gary. You disagree with him?
Well, I mean, I think it's an exaggerated argument. I do think that Calvinists, partly because of their, I mean, I went to div school years ago, and I'd love to talk more about this stuff. But Calvinists had an attitude that it basically was oriented toward the view that you needed to make your daily life orderly and essentially respectful of what God, I suppose, and to prove that you were chosen by God, you had to work continuously to prove your virtue. That's a little simple, and that certainly is something that the Calvinists held, and they become in many ways sort of the forefront, the vanguard of this new work ethic. But it was far more extensive than Calvinism.
Weber, of course, argued that the Reformation transformed money into morality. Mm-hmm. I guess one consequence of that, and I'm interested in your take, is whether time itself was transformed into a form of good or evil. It was, as you suggested, the work ethic was rooted in spending one's time productively, constructively, responsibly. Benjamin Franklin is perhaps the best example of that. Right. So was one of the consequences of modernity to make time, and particularly personal time, a moral issue, a form of almost personal hygiene?
Well, I mean, at one level, of course, I mean, this is a kind of a famous kind of Calvinist statement that you should not waste God's time. You know, you're on this earth to serve God, and frivolities of one sort, like a festival, carnival.
No fucking around, Gary.
No,
right?
No. You know, give up cockfighting, give up bear baiting, give up sort of wild sports, give up these sort of disrespectful antics that would take place during traditional carnivals in Europe and the like, and to take seriously on a daily basis your commitment to serve God, I suppose. And what, of course, happens over time is that you go from meeting house to counting house, to paraphrase the name of a famous book about the Quakers. Insofar as you become more disciplined in your use of time, you get rich.
We are speaking with Gary S. Cross, the author of a very intriguing new book. It's a New York University Press book, Free Time, The History of an Elusive Ideal. We all have enough free time to read Liberties Quarterly, an excellent new journal focusing on a lot of the historical themes that Gary and I are talking about. I'm going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Gary to talk more about free time, this most elusive ideal. Don't go away, anyone. No more free time for you this afternoon.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Gary S. Cross, the author of an intriguing new book, Free Time, The History of an Elusive Ideal. Gary, it's a history of the idea of free time. Who came up with the idea? In your book, have you identified the author of this ideal, or did it just somehow come about as modernity came about?
Well, it's kind of curious. While a kind of a rising group of let's call them bourgeoisie, if you want to call it that, began to insist on work discipline for workers and work ethics for the aristocracy, they also carved up time to cultivate a different kind of way of understanding periods away from work. They developed kind of, basically, I call them genteel values that were more subdued, more refined, based on ideas of self-development and perhaps social engagement, led to things like taking care of pets and reading novels, organized sports, as opposed to kind of free-for-alls, all of that kind of thing. And there began to develop a sense of the proper use of one's free time that essentially contradicted the old carnival culture of the peasantry and the traditional working class, as well as the frivolity of the rich. And those ideals are kind of still with us in the way that a lot of people think about the ideal form of free time.
It sounds, in what you're describing, a gendered quality to this. As we get to the origins of modernity, and men increasingly began to dominate a workforce that was different in the agricultural age, was free time as an ideal? Was it something that was, and I use this word carefully, peddled by the female bourgeoisie, the wives of these early capitalists?
Well, in some ways, what happens by the 19th century particularly is that the work ethic and the free time, shall we say, improving ethic, get sort of split by gender. Women become the sort of keepers of this genteel ideal of free time through domesticity, the proper celebration of refined holidays like modern Christmas and
Thanksgiving, which is a sort of a holiday to thank one for labor in an odd way.
Yeah, I suppose. And men were supposed to spend most of their time cultivating the work ethic. So there was that kind of split. On the other hand, men shared in that culture of free time as well when they were off work, and were supposed to participate in games with families, cultivating the arts, all that kind of stuff.
Gary, you don't need me to tell you this, but up until the middle of the 19th century, America maintained a system of slavery, distinguished it from the rest of the industrializing world, or the industrial world at the time. we mentioned the gendered quality of this. What about the racial quality and the way in which perhaps free trade, I was going to say free trade, that would have been a Freudian error, free time was imagined in the South versus the North of the United States, and particularly in terms of the nobility of not working, and of course the racial implications of that.
Well, in certain ways, the South, particularly before the Civil War, adhered to this older idea of the aristocratic leisure ethic that preceded modern capitalism. And like Aristotle before them, they felt that free time was a privilege of those who did not have to work. And of course, their free time was based, both Aristotle and the South, was based on slave labor. By the 19th century, newer ideas were around that basically said that the new technology could make this free time available, not just for the wealthy who own slaves, but for everybody. And this, of course, leads to the idea of free time as being a natural right, even a right of labor. So by the 1870s, one of the sort of famous refrains from a song supporting the 8-hour day was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will.
I mentioned earlier the bumper sticker in Berkeley about thanking the unions for bringing us the weekend where you and I are currently working, Gary. As the working class in this industrial world acquired at least the promise of free time, how did they think of it differently from what you call, I'm always a bit careful with this word, the bourgeoisie?
Yeah, it's
the wealthy. Was it beer and football for the working class, and art and walks in the countryside for the upper class?
Well, it was kind of curious. If you were a member of a union and perhaps a skilled worker, their values were quite similar to the more genteel views of the middle and upper class. But workers, of course, felt they had a right to do what they will. I mean, as the refrain went. And that if this meant going to cockfights or horse races or hunting or fishing or whatever, that was their right, and no one should interfere with it. Of course, what happens in the course of the 19th and 20th century is genteel views of free time conflicted with what we might call carnival culture of the working class that eventually gets very commercialized with amusement parks and lots of other things. And so you have a long period in which these genteel folk try to refine and sometimes control the free time of working people. You see it in prohibition, you see it in controls of gambling and prostitution, and attempts to impose highly regulated sports on working people.
What about the rise of mass media, which seems to be in the 20th century, at least, the way in which most people, if they have free time, spend it watching television, listening to the radio, reading mass-produced books? Right. Was the invention of mass media in the 20th century, Gary, was it a way of, if you like, democratizing free time? So the upper and lower classes, the owners of capital and the wage laborers, they basically did the same thing in their free time?
Well, the mass media gets very much democratized, beginning with things like phonographs. Movies, of course, were in the first instance predominantly working class. And then of course,
and black, of course, as well, very often.
Yeah, a lot of times. And then, of course, the same thing happens with television. One of the really interesting trends in the 20th century is just how cheap media has become. It's astonishing. I remember my father bought a TV set in 1952. It cost $200 when that was probably 2 months' salary for him, or at least a month and a half. And now, of course, you can get a much better TV set for uh, a few $100s.
And most people, Gary, these days, as I'm sure you know
Yeah,
from your children or grandchildren or the young people you teach, they
yeah,
carry their televisions around in their pocket, and those televisions are a lot more powerful and engaging and
right.
affordable than the televisions of your father's generation.
Yeah, one of the things that media does, and I sort of stress in my book, is that it has the effect of sort of funneling consumption. That it what it does is that it allows people at a personal level to, which is the small part of the funnel, to have choice and access to a broader world, the wide part of the funnel, through initially through recordings and then later through electronic signals that we're used to. And this really changed a lot of ways the way that people experienced free time. It led people to have access to it much quicker. It was and easier. I mean, we get our media right off our cell phones. But it had a tendency to hugely speed up the turnover, shall we say, of media, and in some cases even its intensity. And this was in a lot of ways a great advantage to people, but in some ways it's been disappointing as well.
In terms of the history of this elusive ideal, Gary, free time, has there been a diversion in the industrial and post-industrial world between the United States and Europe in particular, where
Yeah.
people have more free time, where the state
Right.
protects free time? In America, of course, notoriously people work much harder than anywhere else in the world,
Right.
but it also makes it a wealthier society with a stronger economy.
Sure. Well, one of the things that's curious that people don't know much about is that in 1919, at the end of World War I, when there was an opportunity for a kind of an international, shall we say, consensus about how to deal with free time and a lot of other issues, there was a general acceptance of the idea of an 8-hour day across the industrial world and even the non-industrial world. Uh, Americans didn't sign the agreement that was set up by the International Labor Organization for this general acceptance of the 8-hour day, although many people got it. In 1938, Americans went further than Europeans for a moment by introducing a 40-hour work week at a time when Europe was getting ready for World War II. And for a while, Americans actually worked less than Europeans. But by the time Europeans recovered from World War II, that all had changed. Europeans began to get statutory vacations with pay. Americans have never had that. And they, of course, got the 40-hour week, and in some cases, a 35-hour week. And so Europeans have moved in a very different direction. Essentially, there was a kind of a choice to be made with increased productivity. You could either balance more free time with more goods, or you could emphasize almost exclusively growth and increase of consumption with a heavy emphasis upon the work ethic. Americans chose the second option.
And I'm
This,
guessing
yeah,
that you don't necessarily approve of that. You might argue that it hasn't made Americans any happier. Perhaps it's one of the reasons for the epidemic of anxiety,
mhm,
of an increasingly therapeutic society. Many people argue, we've had many shows on this, that most people's work-life balances are out of sync, that they work too hard, and by the time they finish their work, they're too tired to enjoy their leisure. Is that your argument in the book?
well, I think so. Basically,
What do you mean you
there
think
is
so? It's your book.
I no what I well. I mean, you're stating it rather starkly. I think that Americans work a lot more than Europeans. I mean, 300 or 400 hours more a year. That's substantial. And and we have a culture that does not provide. Americans have a culture that doesn't provide for much, shall we call it, national support for things like shorter work weeks or family leave, paid family leave, or vacations with pay. Europeans and others don't share that kind of hostility to legislative means of improving, shall we say, ordinary life. And I do think it's harmful. I think a lot of Americans also have a very strong work ethic, and that's something that perhaps comes from um, the Calvinist and Protestant influence of our history. And so as a result, a lot of Americans are still somehow comfortable with working, especially long hours, that Europeans find strange.
Gary, last week I saw a wonderful new movie. I'm not sure if
Yeah.
you've seen it. It's called How to Have Sex. It's not actually about having sex. It's a movie about how young English people perhaps don't know how to have sex or don't know how to enjoy themselves. I don't know if you've spent any time on Greek islands in the summer. It's a film about how young English people go to places like Greece and drink themselves stupid in 2 weeks, in the 2 weeks or week
Right.
of vacation. When it comes to free time in the early 21st century, perhaps in Europe and certainly in America, do people know how to use free time, or is that an inappropriate, a rather bourgeois question? You seem to have a degree of nostalgia for the agricultural world where people drank themselves stupid and partied, which is what young English people now seem to do in Greece. Is there a correct or an incorrect free time, or is that the wrong way of thinking of it?
Well, if you're talking about, I mean, one of the curious things about what happens when the 8 hour day is introduced and even the weekend is that there is at least some decrease in alcohol drinking, uh, you know, games of violence. In certain ways, working people's lives became more domesticated, more directed around family life, and in some ways soberer, if that's a right word. So in certain ways, those old genteel values that I talked about that were developed in the 18th, 19th century have, in a certain sense, trickled down to working people. On the other side, capitalist consumption has hugely expanded, creating not just a lot more ways in which to consume during your free time, but to kind of virtually saturate your free time with consumption. I call this sort of fast consumption, and that's something that kind of contradicted the hopes and ideals of genteel folk like, well, John Maynard Keynes, who predicted in 1930 that by 2030 we'd all be working 15 hours a week, and
It's a very odd prediction from Keynes, of all people, who of course was an aristocrat and perhaps the most productive writer, thinker, economist, intellectual in the 20th century. I'm not sure whether he was bemoaning it or celebrating it.
I think he thought it was inevitable.
And he was wrong, wasn't he?
I think he would. Of course, he was wrong, but his thinking was essentially that people would choose to, shall we say, balance free time, hopefully in a cultivated fashion, with income and work, and that, of course, hasn't happened because consumption has increasingly saturated our free time. Keynes, I think, was thinking about what's sometimes called slow time, a more relaxed way of spending more hours.
What's wrong there? You keep on using this
at work.
term consumerism, Gary. What's wrong with using your free time to go shopping and spending money and having fun?
Well, I'm not sure there's anything essentially wrong with it, but on the other side, what it does do is that it creates, number one, the need to work more in order to spend more. We have a kind of a work and spend culture. And it also, of course, it also creates a bias in favor of consumed time as opposed to sort of slow time that is perhaps less intensely built around media and built around goods.
Are these critics of advanced capitalism, in a way, is their critique similar to the genteel bourgeoisie who arose in the 18th century and thought the right way to spend free time was walking in the woods, looking after oneself?
I think to some degree that's so. I think some of us, I mean, I'm not one of those. I think that the old genteel attitude very unsupportive of working people's ideas about free time. What's wrong with hunting and gardening?
So maybe we should celebrate. You're gonna have to go and see How to Have Sex, Gary.
Yeah, I guess.
Young English people spend their free time. Finally, progressives, of course, have who are idealists, and we're talking about an ideal free time. They've always imagined that technology could free us from labor, from Rousseau to Marx's German ideology to people in Silicon Valley, like my friend Albert Wenger, the author of The World After Capital. Are we falling into another mythology, another intellectual ideological trap here? Can technology free us, Gary, from labor and represent the beginning of a golden age of free time? Or is it always an elusive ideal, like the Roadrunner, always one step ahead of us?
I'll put it this way. Technology can free us from labor and from work time, but to do that, we need to have new ideas and new values about, first of all, the need for more free time, and second, about our obsession with more goods, faster consumption, growth, and the like. And that change is change in attitude is really a long ways off.
You've exhausted me intellectually, Gary. I'm so tired after this that I'm going to go and have a nap. Is that my favorite afternoon activity? It's free. It doesn't involve any consumption. Is that okay?
I'm thinking of doing the same thing.